what we thought we would do is that each of our speakers has done something huge in a country and at a public level, in the public health level. And we will have each of them share. To kickstart it, we thought we'll have Ashish give us a global perspective on health. What's happening around the world? Can you set the stage, Ashish?
I think I'm going. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to take about 10 minutes to set the stage, as Lakshmi said. And several of the points that I'm going to make, I'm assuming people can hear me, several of the points I'm going to make have actually been made very nicely by both Ben and George, but I will go through them again. So let's talk about global health in the 21st century. And fundamentally, I want to talk about a paradigm shift that's coming. But before I do, I want to start us off on an optimistic note. Actually, I'm very optimistic about the future, but we have to be optimistic even about the present. The world is getting healthier. By almost every statistic you look at, whether it's life expectancy, just in the last 40 years, we've seen a 12-year gain in life expectancy. This is the global number, but we could look at this for Africa, for Asia, for North America, Europe. People are living longer, better lives. We can even look at some of the major diseases that challenge us, like HIV/AIDS. We've had a 50% drop in mortality from HIV/AIDS just in the last 12 years. We see similar numbers from malaria. I could put up disease after disease. We haven't made progress on everything, but on most things, things are much, much better. So the question is why? Why are things so much better? Why have we made so much progress? And I would lay out at least several important components. First is that we have had big gains in knowledge, large investments in science leading to evidence and data. Global health has been a major priority of governments and foundations. The US government, the UK government, the Gates Foundation, others. And global institutions like WHO, even though at times they have struggled, have done incredibly important work. New institutions like Global Fund and Gavi. All of this has come together to make the world a substantially healthier place. Here's the problem. The problem is all of the tools we have had for success over the last 20 years will not work for the next 20 years because the world is changing. So I want to walk through three phenomena that I think are important. The first one is technology. Now, the entire summit is about technology and innovation, and we could spend quite a bit of time on that. I'm going to spend 60 seconds on it. And the metric I'm going to use is just one metric, is smartphones. So if you look back to 2007, there were 100 million smartphones sold. Last year, 1.5 billion smartphones sold. And we have gone in just 5 years from 1 billion people having smartphones to, by the end of 2018, probably 3 billion people having smartphones, close to half of humanity. So why is that important? What does that mean? Great, smartphones are terrific. Why do we care? We care because smartphones are a symbol of the fact that knowledge has become democratized. Knowledge is no longer, in my mind, a source of power and privilege. 20 years ago, only a small select few had access to all the knowledge in the world. Today, half the world's population on their smartphone has access to all the knowledge that has ever been created. This is a transformative feature of the 21st century. And so the value, if it is not coming from knowledge and having access to knowledge, where will it come from? I believe it will come from analysis and insight. How do you turn all that knowledge into wisdom? How do you turn all that knowledge into something useful? And it will come from implementation and action. How do we turn the wisdom into actions that actually make life better for people? I'll come back to this near the end. The second point I want to talk about is sources of innovation. So I want to go through 3 sets of data quickly. One is if you look at percent of global R&D spending, 2000 versus 2015. So we're not talking about long history. We're just talking about 18 years ago. In the year 2000, North America and Europe dominated. 40% of global R&D spending was in North America, 25, 30% was in Europe. These two continents were really the dominant features. Fast forward just 15 years, and things look very different. Sure, North America and Europe are still important, but Asia has taken over as the global leader of R&D. And Latin America and Africa are starting to rise. Let's talk about patent applications. This is just one more measure of innovation. If you look at the European Union over a 20-year time period, it's been pretty steady, about 100,000 patents a year. Japan has actually seen a decline. And the US has seen a rise. I could end the story there and say, isn't that interesting? Japan has had fewer, America is rising. But that's not the story. The story is China. The future of innovation looks very different in a world where China is as dominant of a player as it is. Last one on this is a paper that came out of the OECD that looked at knowledge generation, new scientific research, and collaborations, and where were they coming from. And back in 1998, the US was a dominant player, with Germany and the UK as the major collaborators. And if you looked beyond Germany and the UK, you saw France and Canada and Japan and the Russian Federation and Sweden and Australia. These were the major places where new science was coming from. Let's fast forward 13 years. Again, we're not even talking about a generation, 13 years. A lot of the same countries are still very important: the US, UK, Germany, Italy, France, Spain. But that's not the interesting story. To me, the interesting story is the role of China, now a major player in new scientific articles, new knowledge generation. Beyond China, we're into India, Korea, Singapore, Mexico. And when you keep going and look at where the data are coming from, where collaborations are coming from, it's a far more multipolar world than it was just 15 years ago. So what does this all mean? Very simply, innovation and knowledge generation is now global. It is no longer the US and Western Europe that dominate. They are still important, but the best work is coming from partnerships. It's coming from collaborations from across the globe. And I believe that the next 20 years will see a world that is intellectually much more multipolar than it has been. Last slide, this is something that has been already referred to earlier. The insatiable demand for healthcare. Here's what healthcare spending has looked like just in the last 10 years. Back in 2005, we were spending about $3 trillion on healthcare in the globe. That number is now over $7 trillion. You can see there was a little flattening of the curve during the financial crisis, but it has been rising quickly. To me, that is not the key story. The key story is this, where this is going. And if we're at $7 trillion now, we're going to double that by 2030, 2035. So where are the resources going to come from? And what does this slide tell us? And in my mind, the key takeaways from the global increases in healthcare spending is that the public sector, as important as it is, will not alone be able to meet the needs of the population. It isn't able to do it today. The private sector plays a very important role, and I believe that role will only grow. So I guess I made that point. Public-private cooperation will be the norm. Right now, we point to public-private cooperation, public-private partnerships as a one-off. Well, isn't this great? It isn't great. It's going to be the fundamental way we are going to do things. And that means that governments, WHO, philanthropies are still going to be important, but the private sector will play an increasingly big role. So let me finish off with just 2 slides to make my final points. If these are trends that are coming, if these are trends that we cannot stop, if these are trends we don't necessarily want to stop, how do we ensure the future we want? I believe there are a few things we need to focus on. First, is we need to focus on greater transparency and openness. Because all of the tools of technology and innovation can also be used to create harm and make the system far less equitable. I think we need to focus less on knowledge and more on insights and wisdom and turning them into action. The problem when you have access to all the knowledge in the world is you don't know how to use it. It's too much information. And we're going to be living in a world where we're going to have to figure out how to turn all that knowledge into something that's actually useful. I think we have to encourage more collaboration, not just collaboration between individual researchers, but between institutions and countries. I believe, as I have already alluded to, we have to have greater engagement with the private sector, and we have to rethink the proper role of government. And at least I think there are two important ones. One is setting the rules of the road. What we heard about, the notion of governance. But the second, another notion we've heard about, is making sure that the government plays an important role in helping to reduce inequities. Because inequities in care create social instability, and social instability puts all of these gains at risk. So to finish off, I believe that the future of global public health is very bright. But we have to get to work to make sure that it is as we want it to be. Thank you very much.